they were truly done, you'd be gone by now. Avoidants don't hover around people they feel indifferent toward. When they don't care, they disappear cleanly. No explanations, no emotional residue, no looking back. The exit is quiet, efficient, and final. That's how you know someone never mattered to them. But that's not what happened with you. With you, there's a strange, unfinished quality to the connection. They step back, then circle again. They grow distant, then resurface. They hesitate, pull away, re engage, but never fully detach. That pattern isn't mixed signals, it's internal conflict. It's what happens when emotional significance collides with a nervous system that was built to survive by staying unattached. You activate something in them that others didn't, not because you tried harder, loved better, or proved your worth, but because you represent emotional depth and relational permanence. And for an avoidant, depth doesn't feel romantic, it feels dangerous. Depth means being seen, permanence means there's something to lose. Emotional consequence means their usual escape routes start closing. Their system learned long ago that closeness equals vulnerability, and vulnerability equals risk. So when someone comes along who feels like they could matter long term, their instinct isn't to move closer, it's to regulate the fear by creating space. That's why they don't leave you like the others. Leaving you would require certainty, and certainty in this case would mean fully denying the significance they feel. Instead, they hover in the in-between, close enough to not lose you, distant enough to not feel trapped. This isn't because they're unsure of you. It's because they're unsure of themselves in the presence of what you awaken. You reflect a version of intimacy they don't yet know how to hold. So they manage the discomfort the only way they know how, by pacing the connection instead of ending it. Notice the difference with people they don't value. There's no internal debate, no emotional recoil, no returning, but with you, walking away doesn't feel neutral. It feels like loss, like shutting a door that won't reopen. And that's terrifying to someone whose sense of safety has always come from knowing they can leave at any time. You represent a choice that feels irreversible, not because you demand commitment, but because being with you would change them. It would ask them to outgrow the coping strategies that once kept them safe. So they stay near the edge, close enough to feel you, far enough to breathe. Not because you're replaceable, but because you aren't. The irony is this: the very reason they can't fully choose you yet is the same reason they can't fully let you go. You aren't an option they can casually discard. You are a threshold, and until they're ready to cross it, they linger, suspended between attachment and avoidance, between desire and fear, holding on just tightly enough to not lose what they know they won't easily find again. They don't fear losing you, they fear what choosing you would demand. That distinction matters because it explains everything that feels confusing about their behavior. You aren't just another partner in their life. You aren't interchangeable. You aren't a phase. You are a threshold. Being with you would require a level of emotional consistency they've never sustained, vulnerability they've learned to avoid, and an identity level shift away from self-protection and toward relational responsibility. And for an avoidant, that kind of choice doesn't feel romantic. It feels final. It feels like a door closing behind them, not opening in front of them. Avoidants can date many people casually without freezing. They can enjoy connection when it stays light, undefined, and reversible. As long as there's an emotional exit, their nervous system stays regulated. But when they sense that a connection carries weight, when it feels like this could be it, something changes. Their body reacts before their mind can make sense of it. Commitment conversations suddenly feel heavy, loaded, overwhelming, not because they don't care, but because they care enough to feel the cost. Choosing you wouldn't just add something to their life. It would dismantle the version of themselves that relies on distance to feel safe. That's why they stall instead of step forward. They slow things down. They ask for time. They say they're not ready. These aren't lies. They are confessions of capacity. You activate what many avoidants secretly fear most: the final relationship. Not final in a fairy tale sense, but final in a psychological one. The kind of relationship where patterns can no longer hide, where emotional absence has consequences, where they would have to grow instead of withdraw. You represent an ending to the life they've structured around autonomy without accountability. And because they can feel that, They don't rush to claim you, they test you. Avoidants test permanence before they ever choose it, not in obvious ways, not with cruelty or conscious manipulation, but through subtle withdrawal, distance, silence, inconsistency. They pull back to see what happens, not because they want to hurt you, but because they're trying to answer a question their nervous system doesn't know how to ask directly. Will you disappear, like the others did? Or will you stay without asking me to become more than I am right now? These tests aren't strategic, they're instinctive. An avoidant learned early that closeness leads to pressure, disappointment, or loss of self. So before they attach fully, they need proof that attachment won't cost them everything. They need to know whether you'll demand more than they can give, whether your needs will eventually overwhelm them, whether staying will mean failing you. So they create space and watch how you respond. Here's where the dynamic turns painful. The more emotionally regulated, patient, and understanding you are, the safer they feel postponing commitment. Your maturity becomes their cushion. Your self-control becomes their permission slip. When you don't react dramatically to distance, when you don't threaten to leave, when you calmly hold space, their nervous system relaxes, not into choosing you, but into staying unchosen a little longer. Not because they're indifferent, but because nothing is forcing a decision. You don't demand, you don't chase, you don't collapse. And while that speaks to your emotional health, it also removes urgency. In their mind, you become someone they don't have to decide on yet. Someone stable enough to stay without clarity. Someone strong enough to tolerate ambiguity. And the tragedy is this: the very qualities that make you a secure partner also make it easier for an avoidant to delay the moment of truth. So they linger in the gray, close enough to feel connected, distant enough to avoid transformation. They convince themselves they're being careful, that they're protecting both of you, that they just need more time. But underneath it all is a deeper fear, not of losing you, but of becoming someone new to keep you. Because choosing you would mean letting go of the identity built around emotional self-sufficiency. It would mean risking failure at something that actually matters. That's why they don't step forward cleanly, and it's why they don't walk away either. You represent a relationship that would mark a before and after. And until they're ready to face that kind of change, they hover, testing, pausing, managing closeness instead of committing to it. Not because you're optional, but because you're pivotal. And pivotal connections force a reckoning. Most avoidants have spent their lives postponing. You don't feel like a chapter to them, you feel like the ending. And that's why everything about this connection carries more weight than either of you expected. Avoidance sense emotional finality long before they have language for it. They may not consciously think this is the person I'll end up with, but their nervous system knows when a connection threatens to reorganize their life with you. It's not just attraction or compatibility. It's the feeling that something irreversible is being activated. You don't simply fit into the life they've built. You challenge the structure of it. Your presence doesn't allow them to stay compartmentalized. With others, they can keep parts of themselves untouched, emotions neatly filed away, intimacy limited to what feels manageable. But with you, those strategies don't hold. You reflect a version of closeness that demands wholeness, not fragments. And that's unsettling for someone whose sense of safety has been built on emotional distance. You confront them with a self they haven't yet become, one that shows up, stays present, and tolerates the vulnerability of being known. That's why they oscillate. Not because they're playing games, but because their system is trying to regulate something it doesn't yet know how to hold. When they move closer, they feel the pull of a future that feels too big. When they pull away, they feel the loss of something that feels irreplaceable. So they move back and forth, caught between desire and self-protection. You awaken a possibility that feels both deeply right and deeply threatening. A future where independence isn't a shield, where detachment isn't an option, where emotional consistency becomes the baseline. And until they feel equipped to inhabit that future, they manage it by stepping in and out of proximity. That's also why they say, I'm not ready, but never let go, not ready, doesn't mean not sure. It means they recognize the magnitude of what choosing you would require. When an avoidant says they're not ready with you, it's rarely about timing in the external sense. It's about internal capacity. They know, often without wanting to admit it, that being with you wouldn't be casual or partial. It would be corrective. It would undo old coping mechanisms that once kept them safe. It would dismantle emotional armor they spent years building, and it would challenge self-concepts rooted in autonomy without attachment. So they pause, they stall, they rationalize, they tell themselves they need more time, more stability, more clarity. These explanations aren't manipulative, they're protective. Choosing you would mean confronting the parts of themselves that rely on withdrawal when things get real. It would mean staying present through discomfort instead of escaping it. And that kind of growth feels overwhelming to someone whose nervous system equates closeness with danger. But notice this, despite all the hesitation, they don't detach. They don't replace you easily. They don't close the door. They stay tethered, even when they create distance, because some part of them knows that if they ever are ready, if they ever build the capacity for the kind of intimacy you offer, it would be you. You aren't just someone they like. You are someone they measure themselves against. Someone who represents the relationship they'd want after they became braver, more secure, more whole. That belief keeps them connected even when they can't move forward. It's why they check in, why they resurface, why they struggle to fully let go, even when they say they can't give you what you want. You hold a symbolic place in their internal world, not as an option, but as a reference point. And that makes leaving feel premature, even when staying feels impossible. This is the quiet paradox of being the one to an avoidant. You are recognized before you are chosen, felt before you are claimed. Your significance is real, but significance alone doesn't create readiness. And while it can be validating to know you matter this deeply, it can also be painful to be held at arm's length by someone who sees the ending but doesn't yet have the strength to walk toward it. So if this connection feels different, heavier, more charged than the others, it's because it is. You aren't imagining the depth. You aren't misreading the intensity. You simply arrived at a moment in their life that asked more of them than they were prepared to give. And that truth doesn't diminish your value. It clarifies it. You feel like the ending to them because you represent a level of love they haven't yet learned how to live inside. You were never meant to wait for their readiness. That truth cuts through the confusion more cleanly than any explanation they've ever offered you. Being the end game in an avoidance mind may sound romantic, but it quietly carries a burden that was never yours to hold. It does not make you responsible for their healing. It does not assign you the role of patience, endurance, or emotional availability while they slowly decide whether they're capable of choosing you. You were never meant to be the reward at the end of someone else's growth arc, standing still while they evolve at your expense. An avoidant may recognize your depth, your stability, your significance, but recognition alone does not create a relationship. You are not a symbolic finish line. You are not the future they can claim later once they feel braver, more healed, or more certain. And you are not a placeholder meant to absorb inconsistency while they figure themselves out. When someone keeps you emotionally close but behaviorally distant, they are not honoring your value. They are postponing responsibility. And postponement, no matter how gently it's framed, still costs you time, energy, and self-trust. Your role was never to stay emotionally available while they emotionally delay. Yet this is often how avoidant dynamics trap secure, self-aware people. You understand attachment patterns, you regulate your reactions, you empathize with their fear, and slowly, without realizing it, you begin to carry more of the emotional weight than the connection can hold. You start explaining away what hurts, you normalize what feels unfinished, you wait for potential to become reality. But recognition without action is not devotion, it's avoidance dressed as hope, and hope, when unsupported by movement, becomes self-abandonment. There is a subtle but crucial difference between being seen and being chosen. Avoidance can see you clearly, sometimes more clearly than anyone else ever has. But seeing is safe. Choosing is not. Choosing requires accountability, presence, and the willingness to disappoint old defenses in order to build something new. And when someone repeatedly tells you they care, feel connected, or see a future, but never aligns their behavior with those words, they are not asking for more time. They are asking you to stay small enough to wait. This is where the dynamic must end, not with anger, ultimatums, or emotional explosions, but with clarity. Endgames don't happen while you're still available. As long as you remain accessible without being chosen, the connection stays theoretical. Avoidants only confront finality when the option is removed. Not because they're cruel or calculating, but because their nervous system doesn't register loss until it becomes real. Potential doesn't trigger growth. Consequence does. Your absence does what your patience never could. It introduces a boundary they can't negotiate around. It removes the emotional safety net of knowing you'll still be there, still understanding, still waiting. And this isn't punishment. It isn't manipulation. It isn't a tactic designed to provoke regret or chase. It's simply the natural outcome of choosing self-respect over suspended connection. When you step away, you stop buffering them from the impact of their indecision. Only in your absence are they forced to feel the full weight of what was deferred. The cost of inaction becomes clear. The fantasy of someday collapses into the reality of not now. And whether that realization leads to growth or avoidance is no longer yours to manage. That's the point. The moment you choose yourself, their outcome stops being your responsibility. You are no longer available as emotional insurance while they avoid emotional risk. Walking away doesn't guarantee they will change. It doesn't ensure a reunion, and it doesn't turn you into a lesson they're obligated to learn from, but it does something far more important. It returns you to yourself. It removes you from a role that required you to shrink your needs, delay your life, and stay open without reciprocity. It transforms you from potential into reality, from someone they might choose someday into someone who chooses themselves now. This is the paradox avoidants often face too late. The connection only becomes real when it's no longer accessible. Not because love requires loss, but because avoidance survives on proximity without commitment. When that dynamic ends, the truth surfaces. Either they rise to meet it, or they retreat further into safety. But either way, you are no longer suspended in uncertainty. You were never meant to be someone's emotional later. You were meant to be met in the present. And the moment you stop waiting for their readiness, you reclaim your own. That is the real endgame. Not being chosen after enduring uncertainty, but choosing yourself without needing anyone else to finally catch up. You may be their endgame, but they don't get to decide if you stay. That is the line where clarity replaces confusion and self-respect replaces hope. You didn't imagine the depth of this connection. You didn't project meaning where there was none. The intensity, the recognition, the unspoken gravity between you, it was real. Avoidants don't feel that kind of significance often, and when they do, it leaves a mark on both people. So if part of you sensed that this wasn't casual, that it carried weight, that it felt different from what came before, you weren't wrong. But here's the truth that matters most. Being seen as the final one in someone else's mind does not obligate you to wait for them to become capable of choosing you. And you are not required to pause your life while they wrestle with fear, readiness, or internal limitation. Recognition without follow-through does not entitle anyone to your continued availability, and emotional significance does not override emotional responsibility. There is a quiet danger in being idealized, but not claimed. It can make you feel special while simultaneously keeping you stuck. You start measuring your worth by how deeply they feel instead of how consistently they show up. You hold on to the idea that if they see me this clearly, surely they'll step forward eventually. But clarity without action is not love in motion. It's love stalled by fear. And fear left unchallenged does not mature into commitment on its own. Avoidance often carry an internal narrative where the right person exists somewhere in the future, a person they'll choose once they're healed, ready, or brave enough. When they meet someone like you, that narrative becomes embodied. You become the symbol of what they could have if they were different, and that can feel meaningful. But being someone's symbol is not the same as being their partner. One exists in theory, the other exists in reality. The real endgame isn't being chosen by an avoidant who finally overcomes their fear. That outcome, while possible, is not something you can control or wait your way into. Growth only happens when someone decides the discomfort of change is worth more than the comfort of avoidance. And that decision cannot be made on your behalf. It cannot be earned through patience, understanding, or emotional availability. It must be chosen internally, without you carrying the cost. Choosing yourself is not a rejection of the connection, it's a correction of the dynamic. It's you acknowledging that depth without direction eventually becomes depletion. That love without movement becomes stagnation. And that waiting to be chosen slowly teaches you to abandon parts of yourself you were never meant to sacrifice. Self-respect does not erase love, it clarifies it. When you step away from waiting, something important happens. You stop centering your worth around their readiness. You stop monitoring their growth, their insight, their potential. You return your attention to the only timeline you are responsible for, your own. And in doing so, you reclaim your agency. You no longer need them to catch up in order to move forward. You no longer need resolution from someone who could not meet you in the present. This is where the story ends cleanly, not with bitterness, not with blame, but with grounded truth. You can honor what was real without anchoring your future to someone who couldn't choose you when it mattered. You can acknowledge the depth without building your life around the possibility of someone else's courage. And you can walk away without needing them to finally understand what they lost. If you were their endgame, that was never your responsibility to fulfill. Their healing, their readiness, their growth. Those are internal journeys you were never meant to manage. Your only obligation was to yourself, to choose the kind of love that doesn't require waiting, translating, or enduring emotional absence. And when you do that, when you choose yourself without needing them to catch up, you don't lose the connection. You transform it. It becomes something that no longer defines you, delays you, or diminishes you. The real endgame was never being chosen by someone who feared commitment. It was becoming someone who no longer waits for it.